Okay, we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you to everyone here in Schaible Auditorium on the UAF campus. Thank you to everybody on Zoom, to another evening in our Arctic Leadership Lecture Series. We have two wonderful speakers tonight. I'm going to introduce them both. I'm going to read the biographies of both of our speakers, and then we'll turn it over to Dalee to speak first, and then after that, we'll turn it over to Valerie, and then the two will field questions from the audience, both, again, in person here in Schaible and people on Zoom. So Dalee Sambo Dorough is an influential Alaskan Inupiaq leader, specializing in human rights law, Indigenous empowerment, and Arctic governance. She holds a master's from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, and a PhD from the Faculty of Law at the University of British Columbia. Even before formal education, she was active in advocating for Indigenous rights, notably receiving certification as a tribal court advocate while still in high school. Dr. Dorough's career spans numerous leadership roles, including serving as the executive director of the Inuit Circumpolar Council from 1982 to 1989, and later leading the International Union for Circumpolar Health and the Alaska Intertribal Council. She spent 11 years as an associate professor at the University of Alaska Anchorage before returning to chair the ICC, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, from 2018 to 2022. Currently, she is a senior scholar and special advisor on Arctic Indigenous peoples at the same university. Her work includes voluntary leadership positions within international organizations, such as the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and involvement with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Dr. Dorough has been instrumental in advancing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the International Labor Organization's Convention number 169. She presently holds the Arctic region seat on the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, an advisory body to the Human Rights Council. Her advocacy has earned her numerous accolades, including the Reebok Human Rights Award in 1988 and the International Arctic Science Committee Medal in 2022. In 2020, she was recognized by USA Today as one of Alaska's 10 most influential women over the past century. Dalee Sambo Dorough's extensive contributions reflect her commitment to justice, Indigenous empowerment, and the integration of diverse knowledge to address critical issues facing the Arctic Indigenous communities. So I'm just so grateful that we have two wonderful speakers here tonight. Let me introduce Valerie before we turn to Dalee. Valerie Davidson is a transformative leader in healthcare policy, governance, and advocacy, with a career dedicated to advancing self-determination and improving health outcomes for Alaska Native communities. She was the first woman to serve as president and CEO of the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium and previously led Alaska Pacific University as its first woman president. A trailblazer in state government, Davidson was the first Alaska Native woman to serve as lieutenant governor of Alaska, stepping into the role during a critical transition period in 2018. Appointed by Governor Bill Walker, she also served as commissioner of the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services, where she led the expansion of Medicaid to over 70,000 Alaskans, implemented Medicaid reform, and negotiated the groundbreaking Alaska Tribal Child Welfare Compact with 162 Alaska tribes, the first agreement of its kind in the nation. For over 15 years, Davidson has been a leading voice in national policy discussions on self-governance and Indian health. As Senior Director of Legal and Intergovernmental Affairs at ANTHC, she represented Alaska Native health priorities at the state and federal levels. She was also instrumental in launching the nation's first dental health aid therapy program, which expanded access to oral health care in Native communities. She served for 11 years as the technical co-lead negotiator of the Alaska Tribal Health Compact, representing 229 tribes in negotiations with the federal government. Davidson's expertise has been widely recognized, and she has served on numerous boards and advisory groups, including the First Alaskans Institute, the Lancet Commission on Arctic Health, the Foraker Group Governance Board. She is also a Founders Council member of the U.S. of CARE, a bipartisan initiative advocating for accessible, quality health care for all Americans. A lifelong advocate for Indigenous rights and governance, Davidson holds a JD from the University of New Mexico School of Law and a Bachelor of Education from UAS, University of Alaska Southeast. She's an enrolled tribal member of the Auditorium, I'm butchering this, I'm sure, Traditional Native Council, and continues to shape policy and leadership initiatives that strengthen the well-being of Alaska Native communities and beyond. So if you would join me in welcoming our two speakers tonight, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, Qiyanak for the introduction. And first of all, allow me to thank Brandon and Amy for the invitation to join you this evening, and my apologies for not doing so in person, but you guys got the better of the deal with Valerie present in person, so I'm pleased to know that. If I understood correctly, the desire for the sharing that we're going to do this evening from Brandon and Amy and the course overall is to speak a little bit more about my engagement both personally and professionally in leadership. And typically I'm asked to talk about a particular issue, so it's I have to stumble around a little bit in speaking about my own path, but I'll do what I can to share at least some of the key milestones and also reasons for taking up a role in the field, especially of human rights. When I was fairly young, I remember a story. It's actually a well-known story about my grandfather on my mother's side, my maternal grandfather, Carlson Norman. It was told when I was young, and it really, really influenced, I think, nearly everything about me and the work that I've done. He was on the Unalakleet River. First, I should say he was originally from Ungalik area, and then moved to Unalakleet, where my family roots are from. He was on the river fishing, and he had a short net, and the fish and game person approached him and said, Carlson, you have to pull your net. Fishing was over, and he was there looking at his watch. It's closed now, and my grandfather, as I understand the story, turned and said, we don't use a watch for fishing. When people in the community need food, we fish, and if I'm breaking the law, you shoot me right here, because he had noticed that the man had a gun. And of course the fish and game person couldn't argue with that, right? And I thought to myself, upon hearing that story, and people still tell the story to me to this day, that, oh, remember the story. And I thought about how his worldviews and his life was really attuned to things far different than what we experienced in Anchorage, and also with the laws and policy of the state of Alaska, even the city of Anchorage where we were living at the time. And I just thought his worldview and his way of life was so different from all others, and that the opportunity to be in Unalakleet, to see the fishing, to smell the wonderful fragrance of being upriver, and the berries and the silver salmon, all of that. How on earth can we reconcile these differences? At the time, as I was entering junior high school, my parents were having a discussion about the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and this was all around the same time. And I was piqued by the discussion that they were having about enrollment and all the other issues in the original act of 1971. And so I got my hands on a copy of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and I read the act. And again, this was late 72, early 1973. And I realized in reading it that there were huge problems with this piece of legislation, especially when I got to the part about Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights and the purported extinguishment of the way of life of my grandfather and my grandmother. And that stuck with me. And it was like, no, we're going to have to do something about this. We should all be busy doing something about this, because how is it that one people can alter and change the life of another people in words, and in these few, 18 pages or so of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act? And that really propelled me in ways that even to this day, I can link the work that I'm doing back to that story, and the so far anyway, I think the inability to reconcile the way of life that he understood, as well as what he learned from his parents and grandparents and generations beyond. And I know for a fact that this had a profound influence on what I chose to do. In addition to that, the other dynamics were that we lived in downtown Anchorage, and in the neighborhood there were a lot of politicians, those who contributed to the making of the laws and the policy that were swirling around us. Ralph Rivers was his family; they were neighbors. He was a U.S. representative in the earliest days. The late Mayor George Sullivan of Anchorage lived across the street. Immediately to the east of us, Dorough Bartlett, the daughter of Bob Bartlett, the famous Senator Bob Bartlett, whom people in Fairbanks are very well aware of. They lived right next door, and so we had individuals around us that were influencing law and policy, and doing it in various different ways with very little understanding of our relations. And when they would come to visit, it was always interesting to see the city of Anchorage, for example, through the eyes of someone like my cousins or aunts and uncles, and certainly my grandfather. And one of the other things that I think was influential was the fact that Dorough Bartlett, the daughter of the late Senator Bob Bartlett, was the first woman that I ever met that went away as a single mother of 5 children and pursued a PhD and subsequently went to teach at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And it was just, my goodness, how did this woman do this? And so that in and of itself was pretty influential in terms of the ability and the desire that she had to learn something quite esoteric like Old English, and the passion she had for it, and the desire to drop everything she was doing and go off to the University of Oregon in Eugene and get a PhD, and then subsequently teach English and literature at UAF. It was a pretty phenomenal type of thing to pursue. And I think that with all of these different events around me that were very powerful, it resulted in a combination of legal and political issues that led to advocacy and also led to pursuing an academic career that I think kind of were the recipe that made up what I do today. And it's almost as though, as one friend when I was doing the master's program referred to as taking something that you're interested in and really passionate about and doing something about it, actually really became parlayed into a career. So taking an interest and seeing whether or not you could right a wrong through your own force and energy that really resulted in the career that I've had and that I actually love. It's, people ask what, especially my husband, what does your wife do? He doesn't really know how to answer, and I think that's actually a good thing, but it's a little frustrating and difficult for him. But just to move on to the other questions that Brandon laid out, which the second one being, what do you think makes leadership in Alaska and in the Arctic unique or special? Just quickly on that note, I think that the knowledge of our people and Indigenous knowledge specifically is such a core element of leadership of Inuit, and we see it day in and day out in terms of the values that are being expressed and the source of the knowledge and how it's shared and how it has shaped diplomacy, especially at the international level. I think that if anyone today has an opportunity to meet the present chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Sarah Olswig, who is in Inuk from Kalatlit Nunaat, from Greenland, we see a measure of strength and confidence and knowledge and patience and professionalism through the diplomacy that she's exercising as an Inuk. And I think that really at the core of all this is a very simple mission, and that is to, and I'm just articulating it in my own words. I don't know if everyone subscribes to it or not, but for me, I see it as one of our key missions as individuals that are attached to a larger collectivity of Inuit across the Russian Far East, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, that our intention is to ensure that we are always here, that there will always be Inuit. And it's such a simple target. It's such a simple, at least in my mind anyway, a simple strategy to do what you can do as an individual with your intellect and your qualities and abilities to contribute to that particular mission. And I think that, again, the knowledge, also patience, especially at times when you feel like a very frustrated interpreter between non-Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples, and who you represent. It can be very frustrating at times, but to have that patience and to rely upon the strength of your cultural identity to carry you forward. As far as a couple of other questions, the next, I've thought about this a bit. It's rare that I do stop and think about it, but what is your leadership style? One of the first things I jotted down was that I'm open to persuasion, but everything I'll do is based on solid values. And that those are at the core. I really appreciate the introduction of Valerie and the term transformational. I think that I can subscribe to that. I think that's also a good quality in leadership, that we see. For example, when I was young, when I saw what I thought to be a wrong, that we can transform this, we can reform this, we can change this. And here are the tactics to achieve the objective of your strategy. And so I really appreciate that quality as well. But I think as an Indigenous person, that there's an element of service. I think we're naturally born into service, and it's a part of our values to not think of oneself, but to think of the collectivity and the community that you identify with, that you draw strength from, that you draw knowledge from, that with our rights as an individual, they relate back to responsibilities to the collectivity. So service, and I kind of posit using the word servant, but I think people know what I mean when I use that term, servant, but to be of service to your people. And that I read some time ago that one of the best things that you can do as a leader is to make your people happy. And I think that again, it sounds so Pollyannish, but I think that it really is a style of leadership, and it manifests itself in so many different ways. But I think also that being, in my case, with legal training, being prepared, being educated about the subject matter that you're going to address, be substantive about it, and articulate it in a way that draws out the confidence that you have over, again, it says, I don't know exactly how to say it, but the confidence that you have about making something right from our collective point of view. So I just have to say, it's not in terms of a leadership style, being assertive, but I guess maybe it's really the difference between radical versus rowdy, for example. Being assertive, being commanding, knowing the subject matter, and walking into a room and being able to take control of the dynamics by simply telling the story and sharing views and perspectives, and see if you can persuade others. I've seen at the international level at various different UN meetings, for example, I had an opportunity as the chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to meet with one of the human rights treaty bodies, and these cats are pretty serious individuals intellectually. They're not slouches in any way when they're looking at serious human rights violations. And I remember walking into the room and feeling as though I can handle this pretty well, because I know the subject matter of Indigenous human rights, and they're just being introduced to it. They haven't developed any skills in this area, and that I got this, and being able to walk in and gain their attention and to articulate in a way that is diplomatic and gets your views across. I guess that's what I'm talking about when I use the word commanding and assertive, but also informed and willing to have dialogue, and to do so on the basis of democratic principles and the principles of good governance, which are presently lacking in our current political discourse. And those principles of good governance are even being challenged right now when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are all principles of good governance that are not being displayed, but the ability to carry those principles forward, to use them and behave in a way that's consistent with them, I think is important in terms of your traits and characteristics as a leader. And I'll just quickly sum up with the two final points, because the question was asked, as a leader in your field, what challenges are you trying to address right now? And I think that the way I read that was what are the issues that you're addressing right now? And I think I've already touched upon good governance, and I'm kind of getting the point across about the legal status and the political status of Indigenous peoples, in contrast to getting caught up and buried in the dialogue about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'll just quickly touch upon the recent project that I've taken up at the request of the government of Greenland, and that is to add the human rights dimension to what is referred to as the contraception case, or it was previously referred to as the IUD case, because in the 60s and the 70s, the Danish government went forward with a project to insert IUDs in, at least that we know of, 143 women without their knowledge or consent. And as you can imagine, as I'm trying to edge toward retirement, it really gave me pause to look at the proposal and to say that, yes, I'd be willing to do that because it's my people and women, and the trauma and also the implications of such a policy are just so harrowing and relevant present day because of population, right? I mean, something as serious as contraception and the yeah, there are all kinds of issues, not to mention the Genocide Convention, which is a whole nother matter. So that's one issue or case that I'm involved in now. In the introduction of Valerie, there was reference to the Lancet Commission urgently accelerating the health and well-being of Arctic Indigenous peoples. We're fortunate to work together on that particular matter. I'm paying close attention to issues about Indigenous knowledge and how to influence non-Indigenous researchers who, at least up until the change of administration, were acquiring and attracting substantial amounts of research funding for work across the circumpolar Arctic, and the forthcoming International Conference on Arctic Research Planning, which will take place March 20th to 28th in Boulder, Colorado, where the University of Colorado at Boulder is the host of the ICART-4, which will feed into the International Polar Year, is something that I've been working on as well. And the key objective there is to ensure that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge holders are engaged in an ethical and equitable fashion. And the final thing that I'll say in relation to the fifth question is, what advice would you give to others who are interested in becoming leaders in Alaska and the Arctic? I think that there are a wealth of opportunities that exist, and not solely because the Arctic has become a vogue area of interest, but maybe it's more important to conclude with the comment that, like myself, whatever you see out there that may appear as a wrong to you, and you haven't thoughts about how to make something right, if there's something that you want done and no one else is doing it, step up and pursue it, because you'll find the help, the allies, you'll find the resources. And it just sounds so cliche actually to just do it. That if it reminds me of the comments by Ada Deer, the late Ada Deer, a Menominee Indian woman whose tribe was quote unquote terminated. She restored the Menominee tribe. And again, just like if you see something something needs to be done to fix it, just do it. So I'll stop there and hope that everyone that's listening has an opportunity to think about what they too can do in the field of human rights, or whatever matter it happens to be, that you conjure up the energy and the focus and go after it. So, Cliana, thanks.
Dalee, one of the reasons I was so excited to be able to spend time with you here today is to be able to be on the same panel with my friend Dalee. And she's an amazing leader. And I think sometimes it's the leaders who, I learned a lesson from my grandmother many years ago, that sometimes it's the quiet voice that gets heard, not necessarily the loudest or the flashiest. And I remember traveling to an international conference in Reykjavik in Iceland, and there were all of these incredible leaders who were there from all of these Arctic countries. And it was amazing to watch how people interacted with Dalee. Hugs all around, Indigenous people, thrilled to see her. And she just commands this incredible respect because she's earned it. She works hard and she's earned it. And so, for to Dalee. I first want to make sure that I pay tribute to honor the people, the Kotana people of this land, on whose land we are meeting today. and honor their incredible stewardship of this land, because quite frankly, we wouldn't be here today if they didn't do such an incredible job of stewardship. And also the other tribes who meet here and convene here, the Tanna chiefs, who make this land their home. And it's also important that wherever we go in this country, in this state, in this world, we are always on Native land. And it's important to wherever we go to stop and acknowledge the people who came before us. It's just a matter of simple respect. So huinga nohagalugwa amislamakanan yupiugwa mamtakitlakamio Anaka guyin lokamilk Ataka gasau Port Orchard, Washington nakamilk. Huinga Kekwanagwa Shinkidagwa, Haidagwa, Justa Higgins Agwa. My Yupik names are Nuchagalak and Amishamakanan. I'm an enrolled tribal citizen of the Orujarmut Traditional Native Council in Bethel. That's the hand. I'm from Mamta, which is also known as Mamtaritlak, and Mamtaritlak is a place of many smokehouses or a place of many fish camps. My mother's family is from Guyinok on the coast. If you're ever in Bethel, head downriver, and when you hit the ocean, hang a right. That's my mother's home village. I also want to acknowledge my sister Christy, who is here. Christy McEwen, who is a retired elementary music teacher. So yes, she is a saint of a woman. And when people ask, well, which one is Christy? Because we have many siblings, I always respond, Christy's the nice one, because it's true. And all of our siblings agree, yes, she's the nice one. It's not that the rest of us aren't nice, she's just nicer. My dad's family is from Port Orchard, Washington, and they are Gussak, which means they're not Yupik. I was also adopted by the Jackson family 20 or 30 years ago. They're from Cake, and they're both Thinket and Haida, and I was given the Haida name Jashna Higgins, which I'm told means noisy lady. And I don't actually think I'm very loud, but I do have a really great, authentic Native woman's laugh that is so loud and so deafening. And it's the kind that you hear all the way at the end of the village where the boardwalk meets the tundra, and all the way at the end of the beach. We all have that same laugh, and we all actually look like our grandmother. So one of the first questions is, what was your career transition? Like, how did you get here? And I was actually a Head Start kid, and I think the Head Start program is an amazing program. Later in life, I was also a Head Start teacher, and I was an early childhood teacher. I was a first grade teacher, and then I was a Head Start teacher. I was a first grade teacher, and I was a middle school teacher. And I actually started undergrad here at UAF and transferred to University of Alaska Southeast. And I transferred from a Bachelor of Education here at UAF to a Bachelor of Education with an early childhood emphasis at UAS. And it was at a time in the university's history where they weren't really speaking or cooperating to each other. And so I lost 1.5 years credit in the process. But that's okay. I had a really wonderful dean of education. His name is John Pugh. And he was like, at one point, I said, John, it doesn't make any sense that I have this 3-credit class that was teaching elementary education, math to elementary children. Math is my favorite subject, always has been. But UAS isn't accepting it for a 1-credit math requirement at UAS. And he said, Val, I think it's time for you to start appealing some of these decisions. And I said, well, who's the decision maker? And he said, the dean of the College of Education. And I was like, is that guy's name John Pugh? And he said, yes, it is. Get your appeals done and in writing. So from that experience, I certainly learned that you don't always have to take no for an answer. Sometimes it's worth your time and worth your effort to push back a little and see if you can get a different response by making those appeal decisions. I also wanted, before I was supposed to say this in the beginning, I'm sorry I didn't, but Koyana Brandon and Koyana Amy for the opportunity to be here today. Really appreciate the opportunity. I wish we had more of these opportunities when we were younger. I'm now 57, I'm gonna be 58 in May. And I really wish we had more opportunity when I was an undergrad or even in graduate school for people to talk about leadership. Because I think there's this perception that, you know, you have these jobs and you're the head of this organization or you're in this particular role and suddenly the clouds part and suddenly you are infused with all this incredible knowledge. And while that may be true for some people, that was never true for me. And really, you just try to make the best decisions that you can based upon the information that you have on hand. And just know that as time moves forward, that information is going to change. And 20 or 30 years from now, you may be horrified, mortified by some of the decisions you made, but you didn't have access to that information that you did that for the decisions that you're making today. And I think the challenge with public policy is that you sometimes won't know the change, what the impact was for 10 or 15 years, or maybe in a lifetime, maybe long after you're gone. And that's really, really difficult for an impatient person like me. But just make the best decisions that you possibly can. There was a really great question about preparing for what makes leadership in Alaska and the Arctic unique and special. And the reality is that we are all connected, all of us. That we are somehow related either by blood or by marriage or by cousin, or somehow we went to school with someone who we knew whose ex-boyfriend was, etc., or ex-girlfriend. We are all related in Alaska. And so it is really, really important to always treat people with respect and kindness. And it's actually something we learned from our grandmother. Her name is Dorough. She's the most brilliant person I've ever met in my entire life. She had a second grade education, the most brilliant person I've ever met. And she taught us from a very young age that if you lead with love, you'll never stand alone. And that is so important because as you move forward in your work, you will stumble and you will make a mistake. And how you treat people makes all the difference in the world. And when you make that mistake and you stumble and you fall, if you treat people with respect, if you lead with love, you will have 10 hands extending the hand out to help you get up. If you don't do that, when that happens, people are just going to keep on walking and say, dang, what a shame. And keep on walking. And sometimes, you know, in your career, you may have a decision, something that's moving where seconds matter. And when you call one of your colleagues or somebody you know, when you call them and they see your name flash across the screen, what's their first reaction? Is it going to be, oh my gosh, it's Christy, I can't wait to hear what she has to say? Or is it, oh, it's that darn Val, geez, I'm going to let it go to voicemail. Because sometimes in your career and in your work, seconds matter. Be like Christy. So let me switch gears a little bit. And sometimes when we talk about Native people, or whether it's Inuit people or Yupik people or Inkbats or fill in the blank, it's really, we immediately start talking about our differences and what makes us unique. But the reality is Alaska Native and American Indian people really want what every other Alaskan and American family wants. We want our children to be healthy. We want them to be happy. We want them to be well educated, and we want them to live in safe communities. But in order to accomplish that, we have to do things differently in order to achieve that outcome. Because It's more than just the federal trust responsibility, which has been recognized every single Supreme Court since forever. Don't worry, I'm not gonna go into a legal treatise of Indian law. It's beyond that. It's because of where we live, because we are so rural, so remote, because our traditions are different and the conditions in which we live really require it. So in order for us to be able to all have what every other American wants and deserves, we must do things differently. And that also requires that we examine and take a harsh look at the structures that have been built that we have to live within. Are they the right structures? And I have to say that this whole anti-DEI movement just feels so incredibly disrespectful. And what it says is, our way is the right way. And if you are different in any way, you have to conform to who we are. But if we do it right, you should not have to leave who you are at the door when you walk into your educational institutions, to your work, to your wherever you go. You should not have to leave the very essence of who you are at the door in order to thrive. And we see that happening with our children. Our children generally do well in early childhood, but once they hit middle school, once they hit 5th or 6th grade, they begin to falter. It isn't because we're not as smart as other kids. It's when kids enter that social stage of development that they feel that pressure that happens. And there is nothing more heartbreaking than having your child be questioned whether they understand or you understand as a parent. And this happened to me in the Anchorage School District with my daughter, who was in 7th grade at the time. She's now 23. The teacher at her very first parent-teacher conference asked if I was aware that this class was an honors level math class. And I said, yes, I'm very well aware of that. And she said, well, we're just not sure whether, your daughter is really prepared for this level of math. And I said, well, why do you say that? And she said, well, we've found that students from your background, from her background, don't necessarily thrive, don't really understand these major math concepts. And I was like, well, what do you mean our background? Do you mean students who live off of Raspberry, students who live off of Jewel Lake Road? What do you mean by that exactly? And so really forcing her to address that this was really from her an issue of race. And she said, well, I meant students whose parents don't have a lot of math experience. To which I said, I'm sorry, have we met before? She said, no. I said, well, how could you possibly know that about me or her dad? And I said, I actually took calculus in high school. I am extremely proficient in math and always have been. And she said, well, her dad lives in New Mexico though, doesn't he? And I said, yes, he does. But he is also extremely proficient in math. And this teacher said, well, she just needs more support. And I said, let's just stop right here. I said, you should know that I used to be a teacher. And I also want you to make sure that you've done your due diligence with me before you've had this conversation. So surely you've looked at all of her testing and know that she's never scored below the 99th percentile in her standardized test math scores. And oh, by the way, she is only the 3rd student in the entire 20 or 30 years of gifted and talented student testing in the Anchorage School District. Only the 3rd student, one of 3 students who had a perfect math score. So since I used to be a teacher, we know it's not aptitude on her part. We know it's not parental support. There's only one other possibility, and that's teacher performance. So why don't we spend the rest of our parent-teacher conference talking about what you're going to change to make sure that my daughter gets out of this class what she needs to. And I raise that story now because many times while we're doing this incredible work, whatever it is, we deal with these 1,000 cuts in our community every single day. And they happen constantly. They happen at the grocery store. They happen everywhere. And we have the opportunity to do things differently. In fact, we have a responsibility to do things differently. And sometimes we have to do something I used to think you have to do something even though it's hard. But the reality is I've learned that sometimes you have to do something because it's hard. Because it is really, really, and I learned that through the Dental Health Aid Therapy Initiative, where we were sued by the American Dental Association, the Alaska Dental Society, for providing creating a mid-level oral health practice, the first of its kind in the country. And the reason you sometimes have to do something because it's hard is because it's really, really hard to stand there in the harsh light of judgment and be the first. And not everybody is comfortable being first, but somebody has to be. There are a bunch of people who are comfortable being second or third or fourth or 50th or 100th, and then before you know it, you have a movement. So sometimes you have to do something because it's hard. And the reality is, when we are facing all of these issues, and we can never lose our cool as a Native person because we're not allowed to. We need our allies to stand with us and back us up, because I will tell you that it is exhausting to be the one person in the room who has to speak up every single blessed time, on top of the work we're already doing, to also carry that weight. And we need our allies to be there with us and to speak up for us and to back us up. And sometimes speak up when we're just too darned exhausted to do it ourselves. So another question was, what are the challenges you're trying to address right now? And I will say healthcare. And if you have been following the news at all, you will know that there are some pretty drastic changes being proposed to the Medicaid program. And let me just start with the premise of people can't work, they can't hunt, they can't fish, they can't learn if they're not healthy enough to do so. Healthcare is critical. Right now in Alaska, 1/3 of Alaskans are covered by Medicaid in one form or another, whether it is Medicaid expansion, whether it's regular Medicaid, whether it's a pregnant woman. 1/3 of Alaskans are covered by Medicaid. And I can't even imagine what our state would have been like if we had to go through the COVID epidemic without that additional healthcare coverage. It would have been even more catastrophic than it was already. And in Alaska, Medicaid ensures that healthcare organizations stay open, but it's more than just that. It is a huge economic engine in our state. Medicaid pays for medically necessary travel because we don't have hospitals in every small community or in every part of the state. Medicaid pays for medically necessary travel, and that means airlines. Get ready for some airlines to fold, including our favorite Alaska Airlines, potentially, or to stop traveling. as much to the places that we need. Medicaid also pays for hotels. It also pays for cabs, and it pays for restaurants. Medicaid and healthcare is one of the hugest economic drivers in our state. If that goes away, we are all in deep weeds. And on that note, I just have to ask, when the heck in this country did it become sport to be mean to poor people? I mean, when did that happen? It used to be that when that happened, people were just mortified. Like if your mother could hear you say, but now it's like sport. And it is unacceptable. And we are so much better than that. And some folks have said, as I've talked to my friends or family, that, well, I'm not really sure that my voice will carry the weight. It's all of our voices that carry the weight. One of my favorite organizations is the First Alaskans Institute. And our vision, I serve on the board of trustees. And the vision of First Alaskans Institute is progress for the next 10,000 years, which is not only an acknowledgement of our past, but is also a recognition of we're not going anywhere. We're here. But one of the ground rules that First Alaskans has is in every chair, a leader. In every chair, a leader, which means you don't have to be anointed, appointed, elected, paid, hired, or whatever to speak up for what's right. Even our smallest children know what's right and wrong. And we can learn so much from children who have the courage to say, that's wrong. And sometimes you have to do something because it's hard. And it's hard. Right now, it is really hard. It's difficult, and people are really afraid. But I learned a long time ago that people can and will do the most amazing things under the most impossible of conditions, as long as we have the right reasons. And children and families and communities are always the right reasons. So as we move forward and do this work, let's just keep them in mind, because our responsibility, if our responsibility was just to ourselves individually, well, that would make things so much easier. But we have a responsibility to do things to improve every community that we interact with, not just ours. I think I've talked more than I was supposed to. Oh, what advice would I give others who are interested in becoming leaders in Alaska and the Arctic? Oh my goodness, this is a good one. So don't believe your own hype. Such a basic thing. Don't believe your own hype. Because if you do that, you miss the opportunity to see yourself objectively. And if you lose that, you miss the opportunity to surround yourself with people who make up for the things that you are not good at. Or as I used to say at work, when I thought somebody was telling me what they thought I needed to, what they thought I wanted to hear, I would say, you know, I could buy a really good mirror for $5. That is not what is helpful to me right now. I want to know what you think. What are you seeing that I haven't even contemplated? And I've learned that the more you advance in your career or you rise in an organization, the more likely that is to happen. And if you work in an organization or you are affiliated with an organization that has a well-financed and well-staffed PR and marketing department, you are especially susceptible. Don't fall for it. Don't believe your own hype. Which is something that teenagers show us every day. With that, I'll just say, that's it.
Now we'll open up to questions. So we have people online, and Dalee, we can see you here in Schaible. Anyone have questions or comments for our speakers?
Good evening. Thank you so much for talking tonight. It's been just such a pleasure to listen to you both. My name is Sarah Thomas. I'm an English major and I have minors in creative writing and Alaska Native Studies. I have a question that is posed for you both. Dr. Dorough, you talked about not letting yourself get buried in the discourse around DEI. And Valerie, you've spoken at length about the value of speaking out and speaking up. And I completely agree with this. So my question is, how do you continue to speak up and put these values into action without letting yourself get buried in the raging discourse? Because lately, the never-ending discourse today feels more like a distraction and less like action.
Dang, that was a good question. Dalee, I'm gonna let the smart one answer first and I'll go second.
Well, I think that I was asked something similar by a journalist on the eve of the election and whether or not the results would change the course. And honestly, if you take the long view, and it's akin to something that Valerie has already said, that the thousands of years, if you take the long view, this is just a drop in the bucket, right? This is just a nanosecond, and that certainly as Indigenous peoples, and I've seen this everywhere, not just in this particular political arena, but nearly everywhere, that the strength of your identity, the strength of your values, the strength of your culture, and also that, as Valerie has now said too, your allies and the opportunity to nourish that. I think that's one way to actually rise above the current discourse. And I think that the taking something head on, and I completely agree with Valerie, especially on the Medicaid issue and the need to really pounce on areas that are going to impact, that are macro issues, but have impacts at the micro level of raising your voice. But for issues, at least that I've seen related to Indigenous peoples, that it getting caught up in this current muck. I can't think of it any other way. I think staying the course and continuing your efforts to make lives better without getting caught up in the muck, because you'll just forever be cleaning up and addressing things on a piecemeal basis, when in fact we do have larger objectives. For myself, it's even just as an individual and this may be kind of irresponsible, but tuning out of the just the constant media and the divisiveness, and still being able to attend meetings and walk away feeling as though you've done something good for the day, and that you are open-minded and thinking about how to cooperate and collaborate with other individuals. I I see even the reaction of not just the University of Alaska, but academies everywhere kind of backpedaling when in fact that's it probably won't hold. I mean, and the idea of being kind of attempting to do things off the radar rather than, for example, signing on to a recent letter about Arctic research and Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge holders, and how is it that we now back away from that? And it's not as though we as Indigenous peoples and advocates for Indigenous knowledge are suggesting that we parachuted into this discussion. It's been happening for decades and decades. I mean, even Inuit and Eben Hobson's reference to the intricate knowledge that we hold, that's 40, 50 years ago. I don't think I'm answering your question necessarily, but I think for myself, not getting caught up in the muck and staying the course in terms of advancing Indigenous people's views and perspectives and their interpretations about human rights matters, and knowing that this will pass and we will still be here, and still intent on remaining who we are, and to cultivate the allies that we possibly can as we take the next step and the next step and the next step. So apologies if I haven't answered your question, but that's what's on my mind now.
Let me add, Dalee, I would say it's important to have the courage to have the difficult conversation and call out bad behavior. It's really hard to do that without getting dragged into the muck, but I will tell you that I take the high road every time, but God bless America. Sometimes it is so exhausting to always take that darn high road. But you can do it quickly. And I used to be a first grade teacher, an early childhood teacher, and I have said in conversations before, that's really inappropriate and it's not okay. And then move on in very clear terms and move on. Because if you don't call out that behavior and acknowledge it for what it is, it emboldens people to think they can go deeper, and they can just make it just emboldens them to be the worst version of themselves. And that's not good for any of us.
My name is Emiko Newman. I'm Japanese and mixed, Irish and different descent. I'm a double major in environmental and energy resource engineering. So I'm interested in sustainable development in the public and private sectors of energy and infrastructure, with intersections with Indigenous communities and stuff like that. So I'm actually wearing my Order of the Engineer ring. So I just want to show everyone, because I'm finally far enough in my degree that I am now part of the Order of the Engineer. So yeah, which you probably may not have heard of, but it is basically that it's a thing that engineers do to, we make a commitment, we sign a certificate, and we say, all the work I will do in my lifetime is to help communities and serve them. So yeah, I just wanted to tell you that everything you said was so pertinent and so applicable, and I really appreciate both of you for the incredible leaders that you are, and it's just so necessary. And every time we have women here who are just, clearly have had such an influence in their lives, and by being themselves in these spaces that, have been male dominated or have been dominated by certain racial groups, it is just such a comfort, and it makes it, every time I sleep better at night, because I've met these people that have been through things, or, have had completely different lives than me, but have still excelled and managed to do incredible things and improve so many people's lives. Because, yeah, I also really liked you in the person, because you don't take shit. You seem to stand on business. And that is so cool, because I am trying to constantly do this balance where it seems like people don't really understand that I'm really girly and feminine and caring and a mother. But at the same time, I could punch you and like beat you in boxing and like be one hell of an engineer. Like for some reason, they seem mutually exclusive to people. And like, I don't know, like, yeah, so it's so nice to meet women, other women like me, or like, I don't know, just sort of that thing. So yeah, I have to talk to a ton of people every day, and I actually do run out of words, so I don't know quite everything to say. But yeah, and I really liked the part also too where you said don't believe your own hype, because when I try to recruit people, it's like hard because they're like, wow, you're already good at everything and like all this. And I'm like, actually, like, I'm not so good in this part, or like, I need some help with like the numbers or like the feasibility, or like, I need someone who's stronger in like mechanics and materials to help me with this prototype. But like, people already think, like, people kind of get scared when they find out how much I've extracurriculars or like volunteering or jobs or like classes. And they're just like super intimidated, and they like won't even like talk to me. And they're like, I like have nothing to offer. And I'm like, no, like I'm really good at coding. Like I need you so badly. But people are just like freaked out by it. So yeah, I just thought it was amazing how you understood as a leader how to talk to people and how to use that leadership in such an effective way. Yeah, so that was incredible. And you're both really inspiring to me. So thank you for being here today.
Brianna, can I give one example of believing your own hype? And it actually happened on this campus, and I was so shocked that it happened. So I think one of the things you have to be careful about is when you're applying for grants or you're supporting your work is it really adding value to your work, or are you chasing money? Because that's where the money is. And a lot of the work that's happening about the Arctic and climate change that was what was getting funded. So suddenly everybody was interested in the Arctic. Everybody was interested in climate. And Indigenous people were like, welcome. So glad you're now interested and there's money in it so that everyone is interested. Great. But there was a conference on the Arctic that happened here a few years ago. Maybe it was more than a few years ago, because I think I was working for this right after I was done working for the state. So it was like 2018 or 19 or so. And there was a conference on the Arctic. It was a convening of the Arctic. And there were so many people who were on the panel. And if I had $1 for every person who said, I have been doing this work in the Arctic for 30 years. I've been studying the Arctic for 30 years. I'm paraphrasing, I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I am so excited to be here because it is my first time to Alaska. And I thought to myself, oh dear, did they just say that out loud? And how embarrassing. And then another person would say, I'm so-and-so and I work for this big think tank in DC, and I've been doing this work for 25 years and I am a world-renowned expert in the Arctic, and I'm also excited to be here because I've never been to Alaska and I've never been to the Arctic. And I thought, oh, how embarrassing. And it just kept happening over and over and over again. And I thought, oh, they just don't even know. And I thought someone needs to say something, but I don't really want that person to be me, because it shouldn't always be me, right? And the mayor of the North Slope Borough at the time was on a panel and said, so glad you're all here meeting to talk about the Arctic. Welcome to Alaska, for those who are here for the first time. It's so great that we're meeting here to talk about the Arctic. It's a shame that we're so close, but we're not quite there. If we just go north a little bit further, we will actually be in the Arctic, where the people who are experiencing this, our people, live. And to have these conversations about determining the future of people who live there without the people who are most impacted is a really interesting concept. And he did it with such classic Quebec humor and so subtle, and it was so good. And I thought to myself, but so many of them just didn't get it. They didn't hear it. And I thought there were a lot of these folks who were retired military people. And I thought to myself, I bet they would understand if they were in a conference and all of the people who were on a panel were from China, let's say, and you know, the United States military always has issues with China. And if the person said, I've been studying America for 30 years. I'm considered an expert in America, and I'm so glad to be here. This is my first time in America. You're so lucky that I'm here to have an expert on America. I don't think, unless that happened, that they would have realized that they did exactly the same thing. And so, classic example of don't believe your own hype. It's just a really, really dangerous thing to do. And oh, that mayor of the North Slope Borough, whoo, he was so good.
We have some questions online for you guys.
Okay.
Our first one is a comment from Hannah. As a previous First Alaskans Institute intern, I can definitely see the benefits of having these types of groups who are advocating and teaching Indigenous youth in ways of leadership and business. I think one of my biggest takeaways from that internship was the significance of elders' wisdom and words. This isn't much of a question, but more of a statement of the wisdom community elders can give us.
Awesome.
Abby Charles has a question. One of our topics this week was storytelling within leadership. Thank you both for sharing stories this evening that help us understand your message. Within your work, have you found that storytelling leads to effective communication? If so, what are some of the ways you use stories to communicate?
Dalee, you want to go first?
Sure, sure. Let's see. Just quickly, I'll comment on the previous conversation also. I guess in part in my response to leadership style and the question that was posed there, when I use the terms being assertive or commanding and knowledge of subject matter and so forth, in part it goes to what our engineer in the room was talking about is and the difficulty, especially when it comes to gender. I could say a lot more about that, but I'll set that aside. But going to the question about storytelling, I think that maybe one of the best ways to answer that is that, in fact, a lot of what was happening in the exercise to draft the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was eventually adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007 was the storytelling of Indigenous peoples and the concerns that they were expressing through their storytelling about how their rights were being misunderstood and how their rights were being violated. And storytelling has been a really, really important element for a host of things. Even our advocacy at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has been based upon storytelling and Indigenous knowledge and observations that individuals were sharing with others, and especially Western scientists who may have charted something on a computer about ice melting, for example, when in fact our own people on the shoreline or on the ice have actual firsthand knowledge and stories to tell about current conditions. And so I think it's an important aspect to nearly everything that I do. I use the term interpretation and how sometimes it's very frustrating to interpret information from an Indigenous worldview to those that don't share that worldview. Oftentimes storytelling ends up being the reaction or the response. I don't know, while I have the floor, maybe I'll quickly answer the question from Bernice that's in the chat. I just wanted to say, especially when she makes mention of what is the first sign that an outsider is not really meaningfully engaging with the community. It's amazing to me that many Indigenous peoples and communities have developed their own guidelines specifically for how to engage Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge holders. And it's a way to educate others. And I think one of the first signs is, did they show up at the very moment that they conceived of an idea or a theory to study and ask anybody whether or not it was a priority or whether it was relevant or whether it was useful and constructive for a community? I mean, if you think about it from the moment that you conceive of such an idea for research and pursue funding, et cetera, right off the bat, that's the first sign that they haven't done their homework. They, as Valerie has shared just a moment ago, that, you know, they've talked about the individuals may talk about what great experts they are on X, Y, and Z in the Arctic, and it's their first trip to Alaska. Well, you can be pretty clued in pretty immediately. But I would just share that there are a whole host of guidelines and protocols, as well as rights that back up the requests and the assertive requests of Indigenous peoples to adhere to these principles, and both the substance of them, sourced in self-determination, and the procedural aspects of engaging Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge holders that I would refer you to. And I just wish you the best also in your pursuit of your degree there at UAF. I'll stop there. Maybe I prematurely answered the question from Bernice, but I thought, well, I had the floor, I'd take the opportunity. Diana.
So I'm going to go back to the early question. Dalee, for answering that one. I would say about storytelling, yes, it's really, really important. And here's a way that I've used it in the past. When I worked for the state as a commissioner of health and social services, before it used to be one department, and now it's divided into two departments because apparently that's more work than one person can handle. Except when I was commissioner and other commissioners before me. We did and negotiated with 162 tribes child welfare compact, and it was all about addressing the disparate representation of Alaska Native children in out-of-home placements by the Office of Children's Services. And at the time, our state, and we're back to this now, at the time, our state, before the Walker administration, our state sued tribes more often than all other 49 states combined, and it was shameful. 99% of those cases were child in need of aid cases. And it was about the state doing everything it could to work around complying with the Indian Child Welfare Act. It was a shameful time in our history. And so we said, well, if we were able to contract and compact with tribes to be able to take over the ownership and control of healthcare in Alaska, which yields much better results, then maybe we should be open to that possibility in child welfare with the state. And it was such a concept that people just couldn't understand, like, how is this possible? What does that even look like? And we would hear things like, well, how do we do that? You know, we need to find experts who know about self-governance. And we would say, well, we know those experts. And we would hear, well, we need to hire people who know how to do this, who know how to negotiate these things. And we would say, well, we know those people. And so we started in our negotiation, and we would get things like, well, the tribes would say, we want to propose to do this. And somebody from the state in the department would say, well, we can't do that. And I'd say, well, why not, in our caucus? And they would say, well, because it's against our regulations. Our regulations don't allow that. And I would say, well, who drafts who writes those regulations? And they would say, well, we do. And I would say, you're exactly right. And since you identified the problem, congratulations, you are now chair of a subcommittee. You can pick anybody you want in the department or outside of the department. And I want you to propose a solution to that problem and report back in 2 weeks. And if there's a challenge, if it truly is a problem, then identify a workaround. And so that was one. And when you do that, and when you call people on that, and you identify that we are on a path to yes, people will stop doing it. They'll figure out, okay, no, we really are doing this, and they'll figure out the workaround. Or it may be an issue of that just takes too much work, and they're not interested in adding to their workload, and so they'll figure out a shorter path. But sometimes when we were at an impasse, I would remind people that, you know, this is something very different. It's something very new. It's something you haven't experienced before, and that's okay. It's unsettling. It's supposed to be. Like anytime you make some kind of transformational change, it's supposed to be uncomfortable. And what I would say is Yupiks believe that our worldview is entirely defined by the experiences you have. Shapes your worldview. And it is considered extremely rude to tell somebody that they are wrong. And so the worst kind of question to ask a traditional Yupik person was, this is my opinion. Do you agree? Am I right? And in healthcare, sometimes providers would say, well, Christy, it looks like you're feeling much better today. Am I right? And her answer as a good Yupik would be, of course you're right. Because it would be considered extremely rude for a good Yupik to tell somebody they are wrong, because that does not honor their experience. And so here's an example. When our nephew was a little guy, he was 3, we were in a coffee shop, he was having hot chocolate or apple cider, and I was having coffee. And he's pointed to something on the table and he said, Nani Val, can you hand me that orange thing? There was one thing on the table and it was not orange. And I picked it up and I said, oh, do you mean this? And he said, yeah. And I said, Jacob, this kind of orange is called green. And he said, oh, can you hand me that green thing? And so I picked it up. Of course, I picked it up and I handed it to him. So we should always be open to the question, am I seeing this as orange because that's all I've ever experienced and that's all I ever know? That's all I know. That's the only experience I have. Or are we open to the possibility of the color green? And so many times in that conversation, that story changed the trajectory and changed the outcome of our negotiation, to the point where there are times when somebody would say, well, I'm not really sure about this. And another state employee would say, green. And they would say, oh yeah, okay, all right, I'm open to the possibility of another color, to another perspective and another experience. Because that's the only way that we can make real change. If we're open to the possibility of something we may not have ever experienced before, but it's worth doing.
We'd like to come back to Bernice's question online. So Bernice is from Utqiagvik, and she's completing the second year of her UAF PhD in Indigenous Studies. You both mention Indigenous knowledge as being instrumental in shaping governance, environmental stewardship, and human rights advocacy. With so many organizations and institutions seeking Indigenous knowledge, it can sometimes feel like there's a fine line between genuine respect for collaboration and a sort of fetishization, where knowledge is extracted rather than truly valued. In your experience, what are the key signs that outsiders are engaging in meaningful, reciprocal collaboration versus just consuming Indigenous knowledge for their own purposes? And how do we decide when to hold back and when to engage? And is there ever a point where you're being too protective, where being too protective limits our own influence in important spaces?
I'll jump in. I think Dalee answered earlier. So I would say a couple of flags for me are, is the author actually listing the other people as co-authors? 99 times out of 100, that answer is no. And I also have seen it play out, and this actually happened with our work, and I have to compliment Dalee on her work with the Lancet Commission, really, really incredible work. But we were having a conversation with some scientists about indigenous, traditional and customary knowledge and scientific research and scientific fact, et cetera, et cetera. And it was like, the language that they were using every time they talked about traditional and customary knowledge was just ever so slightly, or sometimes very pointedly, condescending. And so I would say, well, your modern knowledge, when I would talk about science, and one of the researchers was really upset. They were like, no, this is science. And I said, oh, no, I understand. It's modern knowledge. I get it. Modern knowledge. No, this is science. And he became really, really offended. And I was like, this is exactly the same words you are, this language is exactly the language you are using when you are describing Indigenous science. But this is proven fact. This is proven scientific. I said, yeah, for how long? A decade? Compared to 10,000 years? I mean, come on. It's modern knowledge. And until we had that explicit conversation, they just didn't get it. And so I would say those things, like that kind of language, are they citing, are they offering that person to be a co-author, or are they listing them as a conversation with, et cetera? The other thing that I see happening, and I saw it a lot when I worked at the state, is somebody would come back from a trip and they would say to the village, to one of the villages, and they'd say, okay, we have the green light for this participation from this community in this village. And I said, well, what kind of approval did you get? Well, I met with the elders. And I said, great. Who are those elders and what role do they have in the community? Well, what do you mean? How did you meet them? Well, they were elders. Did you just walk down the boardwalk until you saw some random elders and had a conversation with them and said things like, this is my opinion, am I right? When I'm just curious, when you need approval from the municipality of Anchorage or the Fairbanks North Star Borough, do you stop at the Pioneer Home and say, I would like your approval to do this, whatever it is? Well, no. Well, why not? They're the elders of that community. Well, because that's not their role. We would get that from the municipality. We would get that from the city council or the borough or the et cetera, et cetera. And I said, exactly. Why didn't you do that in that community? You did it because you didn't want to have to do the work. You took the easy route and you asked for somebody who didn't necessarily have the authority to be able to give you that permission. Which is extremely disrespectful to those elders that you met with. They would probably be horrified to think that you use them in that way. Because guess what? Those elders in that community that you talk to elected or appointed those representatives on the tribal council or on the city council or both to be able to have that authority on their behalf. So sounds like you're traveling back again and you're going to do it the right way. And the other thing I see happening is states, not only Alaska, but also the federal government will say things like, well, we can't move forward on this particular issue because the tribes just don't agree. Well, how nice for you. If Fairbanks and North Pole don't agree on something, does that give the governor the opportunity to say, well, Fairbanks and North Pole disagree on this, so we can't possibly do anything? No. You work through those tough decisions. It's your job. And you make the hard call. You don't use the excuse to take the easy way out and say, whoa, this is way too hard. It's inappropriate.
So join me in thanking our two wonderful speakers tonight. Thank you so much.